Today I'd like to talk about the words Nazi, fascist, and socialist. These words are often used very incorrectly today, and I think a lot of people say, well, we're pretty close to what they mean. We don't need to be exact. Is it really important that you're close, whether you're close or on target for these? Let me throw you a different word altogether. The word decimate. Okay, so the word decimate, the way it was originally used and the way we use it now, is actually completely wrong in terms of how it was originally used. Okay, originally, for you history buffs, decimate was a practice the Roman army would use to instill discipline, where every 10th man would be killed by the other 9 men around him. And the idea was it would instill such deep fear in the troops that they would basically perform well from that point on. So deci, 1 in every 10. Nowadays, we clearly use the word decimate to mean utterly destroyed. And if you know the origins, when you're thinking of the word deci, it can be a little irritating. But you got to think of it in terms of that was a word that drifted into a new usage in a very natural way. Okay, because the practice of decimation no longer exists. It's a very cool sounding word. It's a word connotating destruction. And so modernists have picked up the word to mean destroying something almost utterly, if not utterly. And so there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, what the problem is with the idea of using Nazi, fascist, and socialist wrong is it's not an effect of a natural drift. It was actually a planned misuse and misinterpretation of the words in order to obfuscate certain things that have happened historically. Okay. Nazis and fascists are left-wing socialists. Those who claim otherwise are repeating a 75-year-old misrepresentation designed to obfuscate the facts surrounding the past and future crimes of socialism. Socialism is a theory and act of changing the ownership of assets to a communal or government-managed communal state. Marx didn't create socialism. It predates him. It actually predates the French Revolution by a little bit of time. There are many different theories of how to implement socialism and what the final outcome should look like. There are dozens of different philosophers who came up with their idea of socialism from the era before the French Revolution up till the time Marx wrote about it. There is not one thing that is socialism. And you'll hear the quote, "That wasn't real socialism." Well, another way that can be translated is to mean that that socialist experiment didn't follow my favorite theory of socialism. And more importantly, if the outcome wasn't successful, it couldn't have been socialism. Marx's theory is an idea that classes are in conflict and are in a state of exploitation. A utopia-like state of affairs could be achieved by socializing the classes. For Marx, socializing the classes meant eliminating class via violence. Marx believed his system of communism could only be brought forth through violent civil war. It was his expectation that many people needed to die to clear the way for his ideas to triumph. Marx's theories cause confusion because there's elements of different forms of government under that banner. Dictatorship, socialism, anarchism, and it's intermingled as various stages of his ideas. Marx envisioned a violent civil war or revolution that would kill, drive off, or convert sufficient members of the classes who weren't the working class, so that the working class would become the sole class. Marx theorized a progression of stages. First was civil war or revolution. The second was a dictatorship that would have the absolute power needed to reshape society. The third was the fully socialist order. or to quote Marx, socialism in everyday life. The final stage was communism, or sometimes noted as anarchism, where the higher forms of government would fade away in favor of localized communal ownership and management of resources, labor, and property. Because of these stages, civil war, dictatorship, socialism, anarchy, and communism, they all appear under the overall banner of communism, and it makes it confusing for a detractor to describe the elements of failed socialist and communist systems. Socialists and communists take advantage of this confusion to hide their crimes and failures in confusing rhetoric. Marxist ideology attracted socialists who felt that the end goal would stop at the socialist phase, as well as anarchists and communists who hoped the final stateless phase of communism was possible. Marx believed in ending the classes through socialization. His form of socialization relied heavily on violence. He wanted to end capitalism, property, and money. Not all forms of socialism require the ending of property or money. Capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production and distribution are privately or corporately owned, and development occurs through the accumulation and reinvestment of profits gained in a free market. The revolutions of 1848 created an opening where existing European states were willing to collaborate with socialists in order to relieve societal pressure. This was the rise of social democrats, who formed parties in most European countries. Social democrats were willing to compromise on the idea of mass socialization in favor of socializing small segments of the economy. For example, creating social security like retirement programs. The existence of social democrats gives an additional layer of confusion between socialist purists who can alternately claim things to be or not be socialism, or socialistic depending on what audience they are talking to. It also provides a useful distraction in that it shows one group of socialists who gain their goals via the ballot box. Not to mention the fact it doesn't seem as scary when you implement socialism piecemeal. So, getting into the meat of the matter. Mussolini was a socialist from at least 1911 to the day of his death. He had a clear break with the Socialist Party of Italy over their methodologies to gain power. Desperate socialist apologists take his statements out of context to create a fictional wall between Mussolini socialism and other socialist experiments. During World War I, socialists of most European nations, with the notable exception of Italian socialists, abandoned their anti-war stances in favor of supporting nationalism and war in hopes that the conflict would bring about the social change that they had been failing to achieve for decades. Mussolini's eventual formation of the Fascist Party was not a sudden change of heart over socialism, but as to the method to implement it. The core of Mussolini's fascists was a faction of Italian socialists who agreed with the idea that nationalism was the best foundation for socialism. Mussolini leveraged another socialist movement called syndicalism, or of the syndicate. Syndicalism was a movement to advance socialism through the trade unions. The theory was that the trade unions would take over business, transferring control to the workers via the syndicates. The word syndicate has been misconstrued on two fronts. It was not Marxian socialism, so for socialist obfuscators, use of syndicate can't be socialism. Second, the word syndicate has been conflated to mean corporation, and that the participants must be a business. A syndicate, by definition, is a group of individuals or organizations combined or making a joint effort to undertake some specific duty or carry out specific transactions or negotiations. So thus, a syndicate can be any kind of ad hoc group that has a purpose. By 1939, Mussolini's fascists controlled 80% of the Italian economy. Areas still under corporate control were under control of corporations approved by the fascist government for their ability to comply with government direction. Corporations that failed to follow government edicts were absorbed or dissolved by the syndicates. Private trade unions were nationalized, following the Leninist model of the USSR. 80% state of control of the remaining corporations, and the remaining corporations requiring to stay within fascist guidelines, may not be utopian socialism, but it sure isn't free market capitalism. There's a famous quote attributed to Mussolini. It goes like this: "Fascism should more properly be called corporatism because it is a merger of state and corporate power." This quote appears to be wholly fabricated. No such sentence can be found in Italian sources of the fascist period. Now, one thing to understand about the history of Europe, one of the things that makes a huge difference between Italy and Germany, because we'll be talking about them shortly, Italy had only been a unified country since 1870. There were strong ethnic divisions between Italians of the North and South. Mussolini's fascists believed more deeply in the concepts of looking at Italians as a nationality rather than a race. People born within the Italian border would be socialized nationally to eliminate capitalism and class strife. Italians of Jewish ethnicity and faith were prominent in the fascist party, and a large percentage of them were members. Per capita, much greater Jewish participation in the fascist party than their numbers in the actual population. During the war, when Italian fascism was imperiled to the point that it couldn't survive without German support, it implemented anti-Jewish laws. These laws could be evaded by proof of conversion to Catholicism. No Jews were murdered by the fascist government for being Jewish until the Germans occupied northern Italy after the king deposed Mussolini in 1943. The German-controlled puppet state subsequently set up in northern Italy, called the Italian Social State, participated in the Holocaust. In short, fascists wanted to end capitalism, end class conflict, and create a socialism that usurped class system identity with one single national identity. If one were to render the concept in English in a way that is readily understood, we might call it nationalist socialism. Fascists and Nazis were mostly at odds with each other. In 1934, a brief civil war led to the creation of an Austrian fascist government. The Austrian fascists modeled themselves on the Italian fascists and considered both German and Austrian Nazis a threat. Italy considered fascist Austria to be a buffer between it and Nazi Germany. In the summer of 1934, the fascist leader of Austria was assassinated by Austrian Nazis. Italy mobilized troops on the border and threatened Nazi Germany with war if they invaded in Austria's conflict. The years between 1934 and 1938 entailed a slow process of Nazi Germany supplanting the Austrian fascist government until reunification ended the strife. Italian fascists ultimately entered World War II not out of camaraderie with the Nazis or a total agreement with their system, but because they feared total Nazi victory was imminent and they were about to miss out on the spoils of war. The German brand of socialism that would eventually become the Nazi Party came in part from the mind of Werner Sombart. Sombart was a Marxist socialist who became convinced the Marxist belief in class struggle as the crisis point for advancement of socialism was never coming. He extrapolated views Marx postulated on the interrelationship between capitalism and Jews. Please read Marx and what he had to say about Jews. It was every bit as anti-Semitic as anything a Nazi said. While Marx believed Jews and capitalism could be severed from each other via violent class struggle, Sombart believed the two to be forever linked. Sombart's ideas, such as the concept of late capitalism, are still used by modern socialists today to explain why Marx's vision has failed to pass. German socialist theorists articulated a theory that believed in something more akin to race theory than nationalism. To quote Sombart, German socialism is accompanied by Volksgeist, the national spirit, which is not racial in the biological sense, but metaphysical. The German spirit in a Negro is quite as much within the realm of possibility as the Negro spirit in a German. The antithesis of the German spirit is the Jewish spirit, which is not a matter of being born Jewish or believing in Judaism, but is a capitalistic spirit. The English people possess the Jewish spirit, and the chief task of the German people and National Socialism is to destroy the Jewish spirit. End quote. For German National Socialists, true nation-states could only be built by Aryans. All great nation-states of history were built by Aryans and then fell when their bloodlines were too diluted. This theory ascribes levels of how Aryan all populations were. At the bottom were the Jews who had no Aryan in them. It was surmised that the Jewish race could only exist parasitically off of real nation-states, and would eventually destroy the nation-state they resided in. Italian fascism believed that all born within its borders were part of the whole. Conversely, German socialism was a form of debased race theory, creating a fake race of Aryans. People born with German citizenship within Germany might not be Aryan if of the wrong ethnicity, while people living outside the borders might be considered Aryan if they had the right characteristics or genealogy. Like Marx, Nazis considered capitalism to be intertwined with Jews. Since for the Nazis, Jewishness was racial and not a mode of thought, the only way to destroy capitalism was to drive out or destroy Jews. Likewise, due to white Russian propaganda, essentially the White Russians were an anti-communist faction in Russia. It just meant kind of a political party. The White Russians passed a lot of propaganda about the heavy amount of Jews involved in the communist government that was forming. Because of this Russian propaganda, the white Russian propaganda to be specific, Nazis also believed that Soviet communism was equally amalgamated with the Jewish people, and that those two could not be separated any more than Jews could be separated from capitalism. Thus, the Nazis were equally opposed to both capitalism and Marxist communism. German National Socialists believed that conflict wasn't in the classes, but in the races, as it defined races. In order to socialize the Aryan people, it required a violent purge of the races causing the most conflict. As Marx called for violent class warfare, Hitler called for violent race warfare. The Nazis believed in the shrinking market theory. This was a socialist belief that capitalism, in the process of industrializing, would cease to be able to feed itself or supply raw materials to itself. Now, if you add to this the history of what the Germans went through during World War I in terms of being cut off from resources, starvation, and war materials not being available to them, this is going to have a huge impact on the German form of socialism. So, this two concepts of shrinking market and what actually happened during World War I caused the German socialists to have a fixation on resources. This led to the Nazi call for autarky, which is the supplying and making all a country needs within its own economy. To achieve autarky in Germany required the resources of other countries. For Hitler, this meant Ukraine to supply grain and the Caucasus to supply oil. German National Socialists believed that total racial socialization and a socialized economy was impossible to complete until autarky was fully achieved. Anything in Nazi Germany which resembled free market capitalism were kept as necessary evils until autarky and racial socialism could be achieved. Lenin implemented the first two phases of Marxist theory, violent revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. The initial attempt to socialize the economy via collectivization of agriculture. This policy brought Soviet Russia to the brink of starvation, which was only alleviated by massive foreign aid and partial privatization of agriculture. Stalin believed that Marxist theory wasn't working in the Soviet Union due to a lack of industrialization. He and his influencers concluded that Marx had envisioned communism coming to heavily industrialized societies. Their thought was by industrializing the USSR, the later phases of communism would come to them more naturally. Mussolini was a socialist. His attempt at full socialism didn't succeed. He was a failed socialist. Hitler was a socialist. His attempt at full socialism didn't succeed. He was a failed socialist. Lenin was a communist working towards the third stage of communism, which is socialism. His attempt at full socialism didn't succeed. He was a failed socialist. Stalin was a communist working towards the third stage of communism, which is socialism. His attempt at full socialism didn't succeed. He was a failed socialist. During the 1920s and 30s, individuals fleeing the revolutions of Russia established themselves in Germany. Their focus was on the failure of Marxist critical class theory and what to replace it with. They believed the reason Marxism took root in Russia and failed in the West was due to the difference between Western Christianity and Russian Orthodoxy. Russian Orthodoxy was ripe for the individual to be subsumed into organizations, and the Western model provided too much support to the idea of individuality. This group was associated with the Institute of Social Research and is most commonly known as the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School's mission was to determine a means to advance Marxist ideas with a replacement for Marxist critical class theory. Their choice for an alternative means of creating the social conflict to advance Marxist ideas resulted in a sharp rebuke from Stalin. This rebuke was very real. Stalin didn't think they were going the right way. Modern apologists insist that because of Stalin's disdain for their ideas and moving away from class theory, that any fruits of their labor cannot be called Marxism. Some who make this claim believe it, others use it as a smokescreen to shield these thinkers from scrutiny. Remember, that's not real socialism. In order to undermine Western individualism, the Frankfurt School postulated several courses of action. Debasement of all forms of art, as beautiful art reflects the glories of the Creator and enforces Christian culture. Debased, ugly, and deviant art distracts the culture from the beauty of creation. They sought to undermine the nuclear family by advancing contraception, abortion, easier divorce laws, and the normalization of non-monogamous relationships. They sought to eliminate the concept of objective truth. Some of this should sound familiar to you guys. Critical race theory is the offspring of the thinking of the Frankfurt School. Now, they didn't come up with it in its entirety, but for what you could hear from previously, you can hear a lot of the elements building up in there. So the general idea is to create and exacerbate conflict between race, ethnicity, and sex. It broadens on the idea that there is no objective truth. How many genders are there? Marx believed in critical class theory. Modern communists hope critical race theory, CRT, will replace critical class theory as the catalyst to revolution or revolutionary change. Antifa traces its lineage to the street-fighting Weimar Republic of Germany. The violence of the period resulted in most political parties creating security forces to protect candidates and clear meeting halls and public squares of opposition prior to party events. Antifa's earliest incarnation was as the paramilitary organization for the KPD, the Communist Party of Germany. The KPD was officially sanctioned by Stalin. The army of the KPD battled paramilitary organizations of the Nazis, but they also battled liberal Democrats and pro-republic groups. Antifa would reform in Germany in the 1980s, strongly associated with the anarchist portion of Marxism. This dovetailed into the punk movement in Germany. The primary aims of this group at the time were to establish squatters' rights in the buildings of urban centers. The black bloc technique of violent protest would evolve here. Antifa would take root in American punk culture as an effort to purge skinheads from the music scene. Antifa has its roots in anti-racist action and Midwest anti-fascist network. These groups would be organized and radicalized by the domestic terrorist groups Weather Underground and John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. The John Brown Anti-Klan Committee has the foundational belief that America was founded as an instrument to create institutionalized white supremacy. Familiar terms. This belief system was indoctrinated into the anti-racist action and Midwest anti-fascist network groups. These groups would in turn spawn American Antifa. To sum up, fascism and Nazism are both socialist ideologies. Nazi Germans performed the Holocaust to implement their form of socialism. Denying their reason for implementing genocide is only to hide the crimes of socialism. The Soviet Union during World War II deliberately called their German enemies fascists, even though the Italians were the fascists and they were the Nazis. The reason they did this was to avoid the embarrassing problem of the acronym Nazi, because the acronym Nazi has the word socialism right in it. Thus, being at war with a practitioner of a rival form of socialism would be very confusing to propaganda efforts. Thus, the Soviet Union called the Germans fascists. Western socialist and communist apologists followed suit. The subtleties between the different brands of socialism and how strongly various methods adhere to original Marxist ideology is used as a method to confuse the average person and detractors. The word fascist in the modern usage of Marxist and socialist has no connection to its original meaning. Black Lives Matter and Antifa are Marxist communists. Okay, I'm sure there's a lot of questions buried in there. From time to time, I'll keep an eye on the comments. If a good question comes up in there, because like I said, there's a lot of material amalgamated here. If a good question comes up in the comments, I'll definitely make a presentation based on that. All right, thank you very much for listening. Hope to see you soon.